My name is Deb Tomlinson, and I'm the CEO of the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services, which we kind of shorten to ASAS. And ASAS is a provincial network made up of 12 sexual assault centres across the province. Sexual assault centres are the ones who provide service to anybody affected by sexual assault in Alberta. ASAS, we look at making sure that every Albertan who's affected gets access to service, and that every Albertan is aware of how big of a problem this is and what to do about it if it happens to them or someone they love.
Great. Well, thank you for speaking today with me.
You're welcome. Your turn now.
My turn. So I'm Andrea Silverstone. I'm the executive director of Sagesse. Sagesse is a provincial domestic violence organization that supports individuals, organizations, and communities to break the cycle of violence. We do that through a variety of different ways. One of them is that we provide direct service to survivors of domestic violence and those impacted by domestic violence. The other is that we provide education and advocacy around how friends and family can better address the issue of domestic violence, as well as how to enhance the practice around supporting LGBTQ individuals who've experienced domestic violence. We also are the backbone organization, which really means the supporting body for the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective, which is a group of people who have come together to make large-scale change around ending domestic violence here in Calgary. So Deb, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about who are the victims of sexual abuse and domestic violence, or sexual assault and domestic violence. What are their age? Where do they live? Maybe you want to start by telling us a little bit about that.
Well, I think I absolutely have to answer that question by saying that anyone can be a victim of sexual assault. And I think as service providers, we have to be ready for that. So any age, any gender identity. If you look at our statistics, disproportionately in Canada, young women aged 16 to 24 are at most risk. But I think it's also important, and also shown in our statistics, that people who are marginalized in our communities or discriminated against are at a higher risk of sexual assault. So that includes racialized individuals, Indigenous individuals, LGBTQ, as well as people with disabilities. And that's because sexual assault's a crime of power and control. It's not about sex.
So it's very similar in domestic violence. We also say domestic violence doesn't discriminate. Any age, any socioeconomic background, any ethnocultural background, everyone is at risk of becoming a victim of domestic violence. And we also know that it's widespread, right? 1 out of 3 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime, or 1 out of 4, depending on the stats. And when we talk about those impacted, those are men and women and children, families. And so I think that there's a lot of similarities. As well, domestic violence is as well a crime of power and control, or an experience of power and control. And so I think the victimology of those who experience domestic violence and sexual assault are very similar.
How do you define domestic violence? I know it's about relationships, but what fits within that definition of domestic violence?
So for me, the first thing is that it's a cradle to grave experience, right? You can be any age in order to fall within the definition of domestic violence. And the second is I think that it's a relationship characterized by intimacy and trust. And that's a very broad definition. So that means that it could be what we usually think about, which is 2 people engaged in a romantic relationship, but it could also be a caregiver relationship, parent to child, child to parent, caregiver that is hired to take care of an elderly person or someone who's disabled. I think that intimacy and trust is a very broad definition, but all of domestic violence falls underneath that.
So, and sexual violence is quite similar. So while there is a minority of individuals that are assaulted by strangers, the majority of individuals know the person that sexually assaulted them. If you look at our general social survey in Canada, most often it's a friend, a neighbor, or an acquaintance. And I'm quite sure that a family member would come quickly after that. And I think that's one of the challenges for people in terms of defining what's happened to them and reaching out for help. is when the offender is someone that you know or you trust, or even someone that you might love. It makes it really, really difficult to understand how this crime happened. And there's a tendency for the survivor to blame themselves.
Which is very similar with domestic violence, right? That there's a lot of internalized blame and internalized shame and minimization of their experiences. One of the things that we know is that victims of domestic violence will often talk about the experience of the violence. So I was hit, I was shoved, I was pushed, I was confined. But they won't often share their experiences of the sexual violence that also happened within that event, because of the shame that they feel, because of not being able to contextualize that as also being an experience of domestic violence.
Yeah, it seems like almost the closer the relationship, the more difficulty it is to recognize that a crime has occurred and how hurtful it is, and to reach out for help.
Absolutely. So I guess the question then becomes, what do we do to start to help people to understand that intersection and break down those barriers so that they can reach out and get the help that they need?
I think, first of all, as service providers, cross-training would be a great ideal, So for us as service providers to understand where the intersections are between domestic violence and sexual violence, and where are the uniquenesses, and how can we be sure not to silo people into, if you experience this type of assault, you come here, and if you experience this type, you come here, because people have enough to deal with. They don't need to screen themselves in or out.
Exactly. And they also need to not feel like, I can only tell this part of my story here and this part of my story here, and I'm going to feel embarrassed if I share the fullness of my experience. Because we know that what happens is that trauma becomes compounded, right? And the more that we don't address those underlying issues, the bigger the trauma becomes, and also the greater the secrecy becomes. And with secrecy comes shame.
And I think for people working in the sexual assault field, it's important for them to recognize that when the survivor and the offender are cohabitating, then there can be potentially a safety issue. When they're not living together, we don't typically experience that as much concern around safety. But we know when they are living together, there can be some really serious safety concerns. And in fact, sexual assault is one indicator of elevated risk in domestic violence.
Yeah. One of the things that we know from domestic violence is that often individuals who are in domestic violence situations will make trade-offs in order to get safety. And one of the trade-offs that we hear women saying is that they made trade-offs around their freedom of sexuality, or their choice around their sexuality. And so in their minds, they brought it upon themselves, or they made an agreement without ever being able to identify that that was actually a sexual assault, because they didn't consent. It wasn't what they wanted, but that they had to do it for this greater good of safety. And so, to me, you can't separate out the sexual assault from the experience of domestic violence or the safety piece, because they're all wrapped right in together.
Yeah, in both cases, the survivor carries so much shame and stigma. And it's not theirs to carry. It doesn't belong to them.
Yeah.
So that's certainly one of the big similarities between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we worked better together, and if we cross-trained more of the people who address domestic violence and sexual assault, what would change for the people that need support in Alberta?
I think the biggest change, which I think is also the most important change, is we would increase access to services. We would encourage more people to reach out for help. And services that will help people heal and recover from the effects of domestic violence and sexual violence, but also services that will help people consider their options for seeking justice, because that's a really important piece as well.
Absolutely.
What do you think?
I think the same thing. I think that will increase access to services. I think that people will be more able to tell the fullness of their experiences. And I think that the more able that you are to tell the fullness of your experience, the less shame-based that experience is. So I think we'll start to address that. I also think that we'll change the dialogue for perpetrators, because I think it'll help them as well to get the support and help that they need. Because this is an all Albertan issue, not just a victim of domestic or sexual assault issue.
Absolutely, I agree 100%.
Yep. So if there was one thing that you really wanted everyone to remember from our conversation today, what would that be?
I think that everybody has an important role to play in ending domestic violence and sexual violence. And it's quite simple, really, and that's giving a positive response to a disclosure of sexual assault or domestic violence. That encourages people to come forward, and that can change their lives, and that can change our world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deb.
You're welcome.